Sometimes the most extraordinary discoveries come from the smallest hands and purest hearts. In a world that often forgets childhood magic, one girl's adventure would change everything. 7-year-old Junie and her faithful dog Rusty were exploring the quiet pine woods outside their small southern town when they stumbled upon something incredible, a rust-covered vintage car buried beneath moss and secrets. To them, it was simply a perfect playground. But when elderly Mr. Carter, a reclusive, former auto designer, caught sight of the car, he nearly collapsed. This wasn't just any abandoned vehicle. It was his long-lost prototype, stolen years ago during a betrayal that destroyed his career. But what happens when word spreads and this $20 million discovery threatens to tear apart their newfound friendship? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted everything golden in Millfield, Georgia, a town where time moved like thick honey and everyone knew your grandmother's maiden name. Junie Williams pressed her face against the cool glass of her bedroom window, watching the world wake up beyond the peeling paint of their small rental house. In her arms, she clutched Mr. Buttons, a faded brown teddy bear whose fur had been loved smooth in patches from 7 years of constant companionship. One of his button eyes hung loose by a thread, but to Junie he was perfect, a steadfast friend who never asked questions and always listened. The scent of pine needles and summer heat drifted through the open window, carrying with it the promise of another day of freedom. School wouldn't start for another month, and these lazy August mornings belonged entirely to her and Rusty, the rust-colored mutt who had wandered into their yard 3 years ago and simply decided to stay. Mama had protested at first, another mouth to feed when they could barely manage their own, but Rusty had won her over the night he'd barked at a prowler trying their back door. "Junie, baby, you up?" Her mother's voice carried down the narrow hallway, already tinged with the exhaustion that seemed to live permanently in her bones. Even at 7, Junie understood that Mama carried weights that children weren't supposed to see. There were the obvious ones, the stack of bills held down by a chipped coffee mug on the kitchen table, the way she counted and recounted the crumpled dollars in her purse before grocery shopping, the phone calls she took in whispered conversations behind closed doors. "Yes, ma'am," Junie called back, setting Mr. Buttons carefully on her pillow. The teddy bear had been a gift from her daddy before he disappeared when she was 4, and though the memories of him had grown fuzzy around the edges, Mr. Buttons kept those precious fragments safe. Sometimes she would press her nose into his worn fur and imagine she could still smell her father's cologne, though she knew it was probably just wishful thinking. Downstairs, the kitchen was already warm with humidity and the lingering aroma of coffee. Mama stood at the counter in her waitressing uniform for the morning shift at Dot's Diner, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that made her look younger than her 28 years. She was pretty, Mama was. Everyone said so, with the same bright eyes and easy smile that Junie had inherited. But lately those smiles seemed to require more effort, like lifting something heavy. "Morning, sunshine," Mama said, kissing the top of Junie's head. "I left you some cereal and milk. Mrs. Patterson next door said she'd check on you around lunch. But you know the rules." Junie nodded solemnly. She knew the rules by heart. Don't answer the door for strangers. Don't leave the yard without telling someone. And absolutely do not go near the old Carter place at the end of Magnolia Street. That last rule had always puzzled her. Mr. Carter seemed harmless enough on the rare occasion she glimpsed him, a tall, thin man with silver hair who moved carefully as if he were made of something fragile. But the grown-ups talked about him in hushed tones, the way they discussed hurricanes or other forces of nature best left undisturbed. He used to be somebody important. Mrs. Patterson had whispered to Mama once while they thought Junie wasn't listening. Worked with cars up north, designing fancy ones for rich folks. But something happened, some kind of scandal or falling out. been living like a hermit ever since he moved here 15 years ago. After Mama left for her shift, the house settled into the comfortable quiet that Junie loved. Rusty appeared at the back door, tail wagging with the urgent enthusiasm that meant adventure was calling. He was a medium-sized dog of uncertain heritage, with intelligent brown eyes and ears that never quite agreed on which direction to point. The veterinarian who'd given him his shots for free had guessed he was part shepherd, part retriever, and part pure good heart. The pinewoods behind their neighborhood had become Junie's second home over the summer. It was a place where a 7-year-old girl could be anything she wanted. An explorer charting unknown territories, a scientist studying the habits of squirrels and cardinals, or simply a child free to dream without the weight of adult worries pressing down on her shoulders. The trees stood tall and straight like nature's own cathedral, their canopy filtering the sunlight into dancing patterns on the forest floor. She tucked Mr. Buttons into the small backpack she always carried on her adventures. The teddy bear was her talisman, her connection to the innocent certainty that the world was fundamentally good and full of magic waiting to be discovered. Other children might have outgrown such faithful devotion to a stuffed animal, but Junie understood instinctively that some treasures were worth protecting, regardless of what others might think. The walk to the woods took her past the neat rows of houses that made up their quiet neighborhood. Most were small, well-maintained homes with carefully tended gardens and American flags hanging limp in the still air. The residents were the kind of people who brought casseroles when someone was sick, who knew the names of everyone's children and grandchildren, who gathered on front porches in the evenings to share gossip and sweet tea. At the end of Magnolia Street stood the Carter house, set back from the road behind a wrought-iron fence that had seen better days. The property was larger than the others, with a sprawling lawn that someone obviously cared for, though Junie had never seen Mr. Carter working in it. The house itself was a grand old Victorian, painted white with blue shutters, but there was something lonely about it. Too many dark windows, too much silence for such a large space. As she passed the fence, Junie caught a glimpse of movement behind one of the upstairs windows. A curtain twitched slightly, and she had the sensation of being watched. She waved, a gesture born of natural courtesy rather than any expectation of response. To her surprise, the curtain moved again, just barely, but enough to suggest acknowledgement. It was the closest thing to interaction she'd ever had with the mysterious Mr. Carter. The pinewoods began where the neighborhood ended, marked by a weathered wooden sign that read, Millfield Nature Preserve, Protected Land. Junie couldn't read all the words yet, but she understood the important part. This was a place set aside for growing things, for creatures that needed space to be wild, for children who needed room to breathe. Rusty bounded ahead, his nose already busy with the complex messages left by other forest visitors. Junie followed more slowly, taking time to notice the way spider webs caught dewdrops like tiny diamonds, how the pine needles made a soft carpet that muffled her footsteps, the sweet scent of honeysuckle growing wild along the trail. This was a world, this green sanctuary where she could think and dream and simply be herself. She pulled Mr. Buttons from her backpack and settled against the trunk of her favorite pine tree, a massive old giant that must have been growing since before her grandmother was born. The teddy bear had witnessed countless conversations in this spot. Junie's hopes for the new school year, her worries about Mama working so hard, her carefully constructed plans for convincing Santa that what she really wanted for Christmas was for her daddy to come home. "What do you think, Mr. Buttons?" she whispered, adjusting his loose button eye. "Should we explore somewhere new today?" The teddy bear's remaining button eye seemed to twinkle with possibility, and Junie felt that familiar surge of excitement. That meant an adventure was about to begin. She tucked him safely back into her backpack, called to Rusty, and set off deeper into the woods than she'd ever ventured before. Behind them, the sounds of the civilized world grew fainter. No more lawnmowers or air conditioners, no traffic from the main road. Here was just the whisper of wind through pine boughs, the distant call of a mockingbird, and the soft rhythm of their footsteps on nature's carpet. It was in this profound quiet, in this space between the known and unknown, that magical things happened, and Junie Williams, with her faithful teddy bear and loyal dog, was about to discover just how magical the world could be. The deeper Junie ventured into the pinewoods, the more the forest seemed to close around her like a green embrace. Ancient trees stretched toward a canopy so thick that only scattered beams of sunlight managed to pierce through, creating a cathedral-like atmosphere that made her instinctively lower her voice. Rusty had grown quieter too, his usual enthusiastic bounding replaced by a more careful, almost reverent pace. They had been walking for nearly an hour when Rusty suddenly stopped. His ears pricked forward in that particular way that meant he'd discovered something interesting. He turned toward a dense thicket of wild grapevines and brambles, whining softly as if asking permission to investigate. Junie pushed through the undergrowth, following her dog's lead, thorns catching at her clothes and leaving tiny scratches on her arms. What she found on the other side took her breath away. Nestled in a small clearing, almost completely hidden beneath years of growth, was a car unlike anything she had ever seen. It wasn't like the practical sedans and pickup trucks that filled the parking lot at Dot's Diner, or even the newer models she glimpsed in magazine pictures. This was something else entirely, long and low and graceful, with curves that suggested speed even while sitting perfectly still. The car was covered in a thick blanket of moss and ivy, as if the forest had decided to reclaim it slowly, tenderly. Wildflowers had taken root in the soil that had accumulated on its roof, creating a garden where chrome once gleamed. Rust had painted abstract patterns across what might have once been a brilliant paint job, and yet somehow the decay only added to its mysterious beauty. Junie approached it with the careful reverence a child reserves for truly special discoveries. This wasn't just an abandoned car. This was a treasure, a secret that the woods had been keeping just for her. She ran her small hands along its moss-covered surface, feeling the solid weight of metal beneath the soft vegetation. "What do you think, Rusty?" she whispered. "How long has it been sleeping here?" The dog wagged his tail and began sniffing around the car's perimeter, occasionally pausing to examine something with particular interest. Junie worked her way around to what she assumed was the driver's side, where she discovered that the door, while heavy with rust, could still be opened with effort. The inside of the car was like stepping into a time capsule. The seats were covered in a rich burgundy leather that had cracked with age, but still retained hints of former luxury. The dashboard held instruments with elegant script lettering, and though many were tarnished beyond reading, they suggested a level of craftsmanship that seemed almost magical to a 7-year-old's eyes. She climbed carefully onto the driver's seat, her hands grasping a steering wheel that felt substantial and important in a way that made her sit up straighter. Through the grimy windshield, she could imagine highways stretching endlessly ahead, full of possibilities and adventures. This car had been built for journeys, for dreams that covered great distances. "Let's go to California," she announced to Mr. Buttons, pulling the teddy bear from her backpack and settling him on the passenger seat. "We'll drive all the way to the ocean and build sandcastles and eat ice cream for breakfast." She spent the next hour in elaborate play, her imagination transforming the forest clearing into a grand adventure. The car became a spaceship exploring distant planets, a time machine visiting dinosaurs, a royal carriage carrying a princess to her wedding. With each scenario, the vehicle seemed to come alive around her, as if it remembered what it felt like to move, to have purpose, to be loved. It was during her 4th or 5th imaginary journey that she heard the footsteps. They came slowly, deliberately, with the careful gait of someone who had lived long enough to know that hurrying rarely improved anything. Junie froze in the driver's seat, suddenly aware that she might be trespassing, that this magical discovery might belong to someone else. Through the moss-covered rear window, she saw a tall figure approaching through the trees. The man was elderly, probably around the same age as her grandfather would have been if he were still alive. He had silver hair that needed cutting, and wore clothes that suggested he'd dressed for yard work. Old khakis and a faded blue shirt with sleeves rolled up to his elbows. But it was his face that caught Junie's attention. He looked like someone who had seen a ghost. Mr. Carter, for even at 7 she recognized him from his rare appearances in town, stopped about 10 feet from the car, his hand pressed against his chest, as if he were having trouble breathing. His eyes were fixed on the vehicle with an intensity that made Junie suddenly very still and very quiet. "Evangeline," he whispered, and the word carried such weight, such history, that it seemed to settle over the clearing like a prayer. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Junie watched through the windshield as Mr. Carter's eyes filled with tears he was clearly trying not to shed. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he reached toward the car, then pulled back, as if he were afraid it might disappear if he touched it. "Sir!" Junie's voice was small but clear. "I'm sorry if I'm not supposed to be here. I was just playing." Mr. Carter's gaze shifted to her face, and she saw surprise replace the overwhelming emotion that had been there moments before. He had clearly been so focused on the car that he hadn't really registered her presence. "Child," he said, and his voice was rough with feelings he was struggling to contain. "How did you find this place?" "Rusty found it," Junie answered honestly, gesturing toward her dog, who was now sitting politely beside the car, as if he understood the solemnity of the moment. "We were just exploring. I didn't mean to bother anything." Mr. Carter took a step closer, his movements careful but determined. "You're not bothering anything, little one. It's just that I never expected—" He stopped, shaking his head as if trying to clear it. "What's your name?" "Junie Williams. I live on Magnolia Street with my mama. We moved here last year when Mama got the job at Dot's Diner." She paused, studying his face with the directness that only children can manage. "Are you Mr. Carter? Everyone says you used to design cars." A smile ghosted across his features, there and gone so quickly she almost missed it. "I am Ezra Carter, yes. And yes, I used to design cars, though that was a very long time ago." He gestured toward the vehicle. "This particular car, Evangeline, she was my masterpiece, my greatest creation. She's beautiful," Junie said solemnly. "Even covered in moss, you can tell she's special." Mr. Carter's eyes widened slightly, as if he hadn't expected such understanding from someone so young. "You can see that, can you? Even after all these years? Even in this condition?" Junie nodded earnestly. "She feels important, like she has stories to tell." She hesitated, then asked the question that had been building in her mind. "Why is she here? In the woods all by herself?" The question seemed to hit Mr. Carter like a physical blow. His shoulders sagged, and suddenly he looked every one of his 70-plus years. "That, child, is a very long and very sad story." "I like stories," Junie offered quietly. "Even sad ones sometimes need to be told." For a moment, Mr. Carter simply stared at her, as if he were seeing something he hadn't expected to find. Then, with movements that spoke of joints that ached, and a heart that had carried too much weight for too many years, he lowered himself to sit on a fallen log near the car. "Then perhaps," he said softly, "it's time this story found someone willing to listen." Mr. Carter sat in silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, his weathered hands clasped together as he gazed at the moss-covered car. Junie remained perfectly still in the driver's seat, sensing that this was one of those moments when adults needed space to find their words. She had learned to read these silences from watching her mother, the way Mama would pause at the kitchen window sometimes, looking at something far beyond the backyard, gathering strength for whatever came next. "I built Evangeline in 1967, Mr. Carter finally said, his voice carrying the careful cadence of someone unused to sharing secrets. "She was going to change everything, the way cars looked, the way they moved, the way people thought about driving itself." He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook, its edges worn smooth from years of handling. The cover was faded brown, held together with a rubber band that had long since lost its elasticity. "I still carry my original sketches," he said, almost to himself. 40 years of carrying them everywhere, like some kind of talisman. Junie climbed out of the car, careful not to disturb the wildflowers that had taken root along its edge, and approached the log where Mr. Carter sat. He looked at her for a moment as if debating something with himself, then patted the space beside him. She settled onto the log, Mr. Buttons clutched in her lap, while Rusty positioned himself at their feet like a furry guardian. With trembling fingers, Mr. Carter removed the rubber band and opened the notebook. The pages were yellowed and brittle, covered in pencil drawings that even Junie could see were extraordinary. The sketches showed the car from every angle, front, back, side, underneath, with detailed notes written in careful script around the margins. "See here," he said, pointing to a drawing of the car's profile. "I designed her with a drag coefficient that was 20 years ahead of its time. These curves weren't just for beauty, though she is beautiful, isn't she? They were pure mathematics, physics made poetry." Junie studied the sketches with the intense concentration she usually reserved for picture books. The drawings were obviously the work of someone who understood both art and science, someone who could see beauty in angles and measurements. "You drew all of these?" "Every line," Mr. Carter confirmed, turning another page to reveal detailed interior sketches. "I dreamed her before I built her. Spent 2 years working out every detail, every innovation. She was going to have fuel injection when everyone else was still using carburetors. Independent rear suspension, a unibody construction that would make her lighter and stronger than anything Detroit was producing." "What happened to her?" Junie asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer wouldn't be happy. Mr. Carter's expression darkened, and he closed the notebook carefully. "I had a business partner, someone I trusted completely. We were going to revolutionize the automobile industry together." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully for his young audience. "But sometimes, child, people we trust can disappoint us in ways that change everything. Did he steal her?" The directness of the question seemed to surprise him. Adults, Junie had noticed, often tried to soften difficult truths for children, but she had always preferred honest answers to pretty lies. "Yes," Mr. Carter said simply. "He stole her, and when I tried to prove she was mine, he had better lawyers and more friends in important places. The whole business fell apart, and I lost everything. My company, my reputation, my future." "That's not fair," Junie said with the righteous indignation that only children can muster. "No," Mr. Carter agreed, "it wasn't fair. But life rarely is, little one. The important thing is how we choose to respond when fairness fails us." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching sunlight filter through the pine canopy to dance across Evangeline's moss-covered hood. Junie found herself thinking about fairness, how Mama worked 2 jobs but still worried about paying bills, how Daddy had left without saying goodbye, how some children had both parents and big houses while others made do with less. "Mr. Carter," she said eventually, "why is Evangeline here in the woods?" His shoulders sagged slightly. "I don't know, child. I truly don't know. When my partner took her, I assumed she was gone forever. Maybe he stored her somewhere and forgot about her. Maybe she was abandoned when he died. I never thought I'd see her again. But now you have." Junie pointed out with characteristic 7-year-old logic. "Maybe that means something good." Mr. Carter looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You're a very wise little girl, aren't you?" "Mama says I think too much for my own good." That earned her a genuine smile, the first she'd seen from him. "Your mama sounds like a smart woman. Speaking of which, shouldn't you be getting home? I imagine she worries when you're gone too long." Junie glanced at the sky, trying to judge the time by the position of the sun, the way her grandfather had taught her. "I should probably go," but she hesitated, suddenly afraid that this magical moment might disappear if she left. "Could I come back tomorrow to visit Evangeline?" Mr. Carter was quiet for so long that Junie began to worry she had overstepped some invisible boundary. Finally he said, This needs to be our secret, Junie. Can you understand that? There are people who might try to take her away again if they knew she was here. I won't tell anyone, Junie promised solemnly. Cross my heart. Then yes, he said softly. You can come back tomorrow, but bring a sandwich if you do. All this talking makes an old man hungry. The walk home felt different somehow, as if the ordinary world had shifted slightly while she was away. The familiar streets of her neighborhood looked the same, but Junie carried with her the weight of an important secret, the beginning of an unlikely friendship, and the image of those beautiful sketches that proved dreams could be captured on paper even when reality broke them apart. When she arrived home, Mama was already back from her shift at the diner, sitting at the kitchen table, sorting through a stack of mail with the expression she wore when calculating how to stretch dollars until payday. She looked up when Junie came through the back door, and her face immediately brightened. "There's my explorer. Did you and Rusty have a good adventure today?" "Yes, Ma'am," Junie answered truthfully, though the full truth would have to remain locked away like treasure in a secret box. "We found some really pretty flowers in the woods." "That's nice, baby. Go wash up for dinner. I brought home some soup from the diner." As Junie headed toward the bathroom, she heard her mother's tired sigh and the soft rustle of papers being shuffled. Tomorrow, she would return to the clearing, to Evangeline and Mr. Iki, Carter and the sketches that held dreams older than she was. But tonight she would help Mama count change and pretend not to notice the worried lines around her eyes, carrying her secret like a small flame that warmed her from the inside. For 3 wonderful days, Junie kept her promise. Each morning after Mama left for work, she would pack a lunch for 2 and venture into the pinewoods, where Mr. Carter waited beside Evangeline with his notebook of sketches and stories that spanned decades. He told her about the automotive shows, where crowds had gathered to admire his designs, about the excitement of seeing his ideas transformed into metal and chrome, about the moment he first turned Evangeline's key and heard her engine purr to life. Junie listened with the rapt attention she usually reserved for bedtime stories, asking questions that revealed an understanding that surprised even her. She wanted to know how the curves of the body affected the way air moved around the car, why certain materials were chosen over others, what it felt like to create something that had never existed before. Mr. Carter found himself explaining complex engineering concepts in simple terms, rediscovering the joy of sharing knowledge with someone whose curiosity was pure and unguarded. On the 4th day, everything changed. It started innocently enough. Junie was sitting on her front porch after lunch, brushing the tangles from Mr. Buttons's fur, when her best friend Maya Rodriguez came skipping up the sidewalk. Maya was 8, and possessed the kind of boundless energy that made adults reach instinctively for headache medicine. She also had an unfortunate talent for extracting secrets through sheer persistence. "Where have you been disappearing to every day?" Maya demanded without preamble, plopping down on the porch steps. "My mama says your mama's been asking around if anyone's seen you playing in the neighborhood, but nobody has." "Just exploring," Junie answered carefully, not looking up from her teddy bear. "Exploring where? I know every good hiding spot within 5 blocks. There's nowhere you could go that I haven't already been." "The woods behind the neighborhood. Those boring old woods? There's nothing back there but trees and bugs and probably snakes." Maya wrinkled her nose in disgust. "Why would you want to spend time there when we could be riding bikes or playing at the park?" Junie should have changed the subject. She should have suggested they go inside for popsicles or asked Maya about her swimming lessons. Instead, perhaps because she was 7 years old and the secret had grown too big to carry alone, she said, "I found something really amazing back there." Maya's eyes lit up with the predatory gleam of a child who sensed a mystery. "What kind of something?" "An old car. Really old and fancy, covered in moss, like it's been sleeping in the forest for years." "No way. You're making that up." "I am not," Junie protested, stung by the accusation. "It's the most beautiful car you've ever seen, and there's this old man who designed it, and he has drawings that show every part of it, and she stopped, realizing too late that the words had tumbled out like water from a broken dam. Maya was staring at her with the wide-eyed expression of someone who had just struck gold. An old car worth money, hidden in the woods, and you've been keeping it secret? Maya jumped to her feet, practically vibrating with excitement. We have to tell someone. We have to tell everyone. No. Junie stood too, clutching Mr. Buttons protectively. It's a secret. I promised I wouldn't tell anyone. But Maya was already backing toward the street, her mind clearly racing with possibilities. My uncle works for the newspaper. He's always looking for interesting stories. A mysterious car hidden in the woods. That's like treasure or something. Maya, please don't. But her friend was already running toward home, leaving Junie standing on the porch with the horrible realization that she had just broken the most important promise of her young life. The newspaper article appeared 3 days later on the front page of the Millfield Weekly Herald. Maya's uncle had indeed found the story irresistible, especially after a few phone calls revealed that the car in question might be worth significantly more than anyone had imagined. The headline read, $1 million car found in local woods, and featured a grainy photograph of Evangeline that somehow managed to capture her beauty, even beneath the moss and rust. Junie discovered the article when Mrs. Patterson brought it over to show Mama, her eyes bright with the excitement of being close to local celebrity. Can you believe it, Linda? Right here in our own backyard. They say it might be worth $20 million. $20 million, and little Junie found it. Mama read the article twice, her expression growing more troubled with each word. The piece quoted unnamed sources describing a precocious local child who had stumbled upon what automotive experts were calling potentially one of the most significant barn finds in history. It mentioned Mr. Carter by name, identifying him as a reclusive former designer whose revolutionary prototype had been missing for decades. Junie, Mama said quietly, setting down the newspaper, is there something you need to tell me? The confession poured out of her. The discovery, the friendship with Mr. Carter, the stories and sketches, the promise she had made and broken. Mama listened without interruption, her face cycling through confusion, concern, and something that might have been pride. Baby, why didn't you tell me about this man? I've been worried sick about where you've been disappearing to every day. He's not scary, Mama. He's just sad and lonely, and he loves that car so much it makes him cry sometimes. Before Mama could respond, they heard the sound of vehicles pulling up outside, multiple vehicles from the sound of it. Through the living room window, they could see a small convoy headed toward the woods. 2 cars with press credentials, a van from the regional television station, and a pickup truck carrying what appeared to be photography equipment. By afternoon, the quiet sanctity of the pinewoods had been transformed into a 3-ring circus. The newspaper had included enough detail for determined treasure hunters to locate Evangeline's resting place, and word had spread through social media and local news outlets like wildfire. Families arrived with picnic lunches and cameras, treating the discovery like a tourist attraction. Photographers climbed over the car, taking pictures from every angle, their flashes reflecting off her moss-covered surface like tiny lightning strikes. Junie watched the chaos from the edge of the woods, her heart breaking with each intrusion into what had been their peaceful sanctuary. But it was the sight of Mr. Carter that truly devastated her. He stood at the far edge of the clearing, his notebook clutched against his chest, watching strangers pore over his masterpiece with an expression of such profound loss that Junie felt tears streaming down her cheeks. When their eyes met across the crowd, she saw something die in his face. Not anger, which she could have borne, but a deep, weary resignation that spoke of promises broken once too often. He turned and walked away through the trees, his shoulders bent as if he were carrying an unbearable weight. Junie ran after him, pushing through the crowd of curiosity seekers and reporters, calling his name. But Mr. Carter didn't stop, didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge her pleas for forgiveness. He simply disappeared into the forest like a ghost, leaving her standing alone among strangers who were treating their sanctuary like a sideshow. That night, clutching Mr. Buttons tightly against her chest, Junie cried herself to sleep. She had learned the hardest lesson of her young life, that some secrets are worth more than gold, and that breaking a promise can shatter something far more precious than any treasure hidden in the woods. For a week after the newspaper article appeared, Junie didn't venture into the pinewoods. The guilt sat in her stomach like a stone, making it hard to eat Mama's carefully prepared meals or enjoy the simple pleasures that usually filled her summer days. She spent most of her time on the front porch with Mr. Buttons, watching the steady stream of cars that came and went from the direction of the woods, each one carrying strangers eager for a glimpse of the famous hidden treasure. Mrs. Patterson reported that Mr. Carter had been seen at the grocery store looking drawn and tired, and that he'd been keeping his curtains drawn tight against the curious eyes of reporters who had taken to parking outside his gate. The whole situation made Junie feel sick with remorse. She had broken more than a promise. She had broken trust, and at 7 years old, she was beginning to understand that trust was something far more fragile and precious than she had realized. On the 8th day, she couldn't stand it anymore. Despite Mama's concerns about the crowds and the media attention, Junie slipped away after lunch and made her way to the woods. What she found there broke her heart all over again. Someone had hung a rope across the path leading to Evangeline's clearing, with a hand-lettered sign that read, "Private property, no trespassing." More disturbing were the obvious signs of damage. Broken branches where people had pushed through the undergrowth, litter scattered around the base of trees, and deep tire ruts where someone had tried to drive a vehicle closer to the site. But Evangeline herself looked worse than ever. The constant stream of visitors had worn away much of the protective moss that had covered her for decades, exposing rust and weathered metal to the harsh scrutiny of daylight. Someone had tried to pry open her hood, leaving scratches and dents that made Junie want to cry. She was standing there surveying the damage when she heard footsteps behind her. This time she recognized the careful, measured pace, and her heart leaped with hope even as her stomach clenched with anxiety. "Mr. Carter," she said, without turning around, "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I know you didn't." "Child," his voice was tired but not unkind. "Sometimes the consequences of our actions stretch further than we intend." She turned to face him, and was relieved to see that while his eyes held sadness, they weren't filled with the anger or disappointment she had feared. If anything, he looked older, more fragile, as if the past week had aged him years. "I tried to stop it," she said, tears threatening to spill over. "When Maya said she was going to tell her uncle, I tried to make her promise not to. But she was already running away, and then the newspaper came, and then all these people—" "Junie," Mr. Carter's gentle interruption stopped her rambling explanation. "You're 7 years old. The burden of keeping adult secrets shouldn't fall on shoulders as small as yours, but I promised." "Yes, you did, and promises matter." He moved closer to Evangeline, running his weathered hand along her damaged surface with the tenderness of someone touching a beloved but injured friend. "But perhaps it's time for this old girl to face the world again, even if it's not the world I would have chosen for her." Over the following days, a strange partnership developed between the elderly man and the young girl. While lawyers and insurance investigators and automotive experts argued over ownership and value and legal precedents, Junie and Mr. Carter became Evangeline's unofficial guardians. They arrived each morning before the crowds, armed with cleaning supplies and a determination to protect what they could of the car's dignity. Mr. Carter taught Junie how to carefully remove the moss and debris without damaging the metal underneath, explaining the difference between surface rust and structural damage, showing her how to identify original parts versus later modifications. She proved to be a remarkably quick study, asking questions that revealed an intuitive understanding of mechanical principles that surprised him. "See here," he said one morning, pointing to a section of the car's undercarriage. "This is the independent rear suspension I was telling you about. Do you understand why that's important?" Junie studied the components with the serious concentration she usually reserved for picture books, because it lets each wheel move by itself instead of being connected to the other one. So if one wheel hits a bump, it doesn't bounce the whole back of the car. Exactly. Mr. Carter smiled, and Junie felt a warm glow of pride. Most cars in 1967 still used solid rear axles. This design wouldn't become common for another 20 years. Their work sessions became extended lessons in automotive history, engineering principles, and design philosophy. Mr. Carter found himself looking forward to these morning meetings, rediscovering the joy of sharing knowledge with someone whose enthusiasm was infectious. Junie's questions pushed him to think about his work in new ways, to explain complex concepts in simple terms that often revealed deeper truths. It was during one of these sessions that he presented her with a gift that would become one of her most treasured possessions. They had been working to clean the car's interior when Mr. Carter reached into his tool bag and pulled out a small wooden object wrapped in faded tissue paper. "I made this for you," he said simply, placing it in her hands. Junie unwrapped the tissue paper carefully, revealing a miniature car carved from smooth, honey-colored wood. It was clearly meant to be Evangeline. The proportions were perfect, every curve and line captured in exquisite detail. Even the tiny wheels could turn, and the doors opened to reveal an interior complete with tiny seats and a detailed dashboard. "You made this?" she breathed, turning the little car over in her hands with reverent care. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." "I've been whittling since I was younger than you," Mr. Carter said, though his gruff tone couldn't quite hide his pleasure at her reaction. "Figured Evangeline deserved a little sister, one that nobody can take away or argue over or turn into a circus attraction." Junie looked up at him with shining eyes. "This means you forgive me." "Child, there was never anything to forgive. You're 7 years old, and you were excited about a wonderful discovery. The fault lies with adults who should know better than to turn a child's innocent adventure into a media spectacle." The legal complications, however, were just beginning. Lawyers representing various parties had descended upon Millfield like locusts, some claiming to represent Mr. Carter's former business partner's estate, others arguing that the car had been abandoned long enough to fall under treasure trove laws, still others insisting that the state had rights to any significant archaeological finds on public land. The community itself was divided. Some residents were thrilled by the attention and potential economic benefits that tourism might bring. Others resented the disruption to their quiet way of life, and the way their peaceful woods had been transformed into a battleground for competing interests. Mama had begun to worry about Junie's involvement in what was clearly becoming a complex legal situation. "I don't want you getting caught up in grown-up problems," she said one evening as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset. "And I'm not sure it's appropriate for you to be spending so much time with a man we barely know." But Junie had seen the gentleness in Mr. Carter's eyes when he handed her the wooden car, had witnessed the careful way he explained complicated concepts, had watched him tend to Evangeline with the devotion of someone caring for a family member. Whatever secrets the adults were fighting over, she knew that Mr. Carter was good and kind, and had become something precious in her life, a grandfather figure she had never had, a teacher who treated her intelligence with respect, a friend who shared her wonder at the magic hidden in ordinary things. That night, she placed the wooden car on her nightstand next to Mr. Button's, two treasures that represented the most important relationships in her young life. Tomorrow would bring more lawyers and reporters and complicated adult problems, but tonight she held close the knowledge that trust, once broken, could be rebuilt with patience and understanding and the simple gift of something made with love. The morning arrived grey and humid, with the kind of oppressive heat that made even the pine trees seem to droop with exhaustion. Junie found Mr. Carter sitting on his usual fallen log beside Evangeline, but something was different about him today. His shoulders carried a weight that seemed heavier than usual, and his weathered hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages of his sketch notebook. "The lawyers want to take her away again," he said without looking up when Junie approached. "They claim they need to examine her for evidence in the ownership dispute." Evidence. He spoke the word like it tasted bitter. Junie settled beside him, the wooden car he had carved for her tucked safely in her pocket. She had taken to carrying it everywhere, a tangible reminder that some things, friendship, trust, love, couldn't be stolen or disputed in courtrooms. They can't just take her, can they? She belongs to you. Belonging and being able to prove belonging are two different things. Little one. Mr. Carter closed the notebook and stared at Evangeline with eyes that held decades of accumulated pain. "I learned that lesson the hard way 40 years ago." "Will you tell me what really happened?" Junie asked softly. "The whole story, not just the parts you think I'm old enough to hear." Mr. Carter looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing whether a 7-year-old could handle the full weight of adult betrayal and broken dreams. Finally, he reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out something Junie had never seen before. A small, faded photograph with cracked edges and colors that had shifted towards sepia with age. The picture showed 2 young men standing beside a gleaming car that was unmistakably Evangeline in her original glory. They wore the casual confidence of people who believed the world was full of possibilities, their arms thrown around each other's shoulders in easy friendship. One of them was clearly a younger version of Mr. Carter, his hair dark instead of silver, his face unlined by years of disappointment. The other man was shorter, stockier, with an infectious grin that seemed to light up the entire photograph. "That's William Hartwell," Mr. Carter said, his finger tracing the outline of the shorter man. "Billy, I called him. My best friend, my business partner, and the person I trusted more than anyone else in the world." He paused, lost in memories that were obviously still painful after all these years. "We met in engineering school, became roommates, then partners in the most ambitious automotive venture Detroit had seen in decades." "He looks nice," Junie observed, studying the photograph with the careful attention she gave to anything important. "He was nice. That's what made it so hard to understand afterward." Mr. Carter's voice grew distant, as if he were speaking from across a great divide of time and experience. "Billy was the business mind. I was the design genius. We complemented each other perfectly. While I was dreaming up revolutionary suspension systems and aerodynamic profiles, he was talking to investors, negotiating contracts, handling all the parts of running a company that I found tedious." He pointed to Evangeline in the photograph, her pristine chrome catching the sunlight like liquid silver. "We spent 3 years developing her. Every component was custom designed. Every system was an advancement over existing technology. She wasn't just a car. She was a statement about what transportation could become in the future. We had orders from 3 major manufacturers who wanted to license our innovations." "What went wrong?" Junie asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer. "Money troubles hit the company. We needed capital to fulfill the manufacturing contracts, but the banks were nervous about lending to such a small operation. Billy said he had found private investors, wealthy collectors who understood the value of what we were creating." Mr. Carter's jaw tightened, and Junie could see the muscle working as he fought to control emotions that were still raw after 4 decades. "One morning I came to the shop and Evangeline was gone. Billy was gone. The office had been cleaned out. Files, blueprints, financial records, everything. It was like our entire partnership had been erased overnight." Junie felt a familiar anger rising in her chest. The same righteous indignation she experienced when children at school were mean to each other for no reason. He stole everything, not just the car and the designs. He had been our company's sole signatory on the bank accounts. I trusted him completely with the business side of things. He took every penny we had, along with the advance payments from the manufacturers. When I tried to report the theft, I discovered that Billy had somehow maneuvered things so that all the legal paperwork showed him as the sole owner of our company. According to the law, he hadn't stolen anything. He had simply taken what belonged to him. But that's not true, Junie protested. You drew all the pictures. You designed everything. Truth and legal reality don't always align, child. Billy had covered his tracks carefully. He claimed I was just an employee, a hired designer whose ideas belonged to the company he owned. When I showed them my original sketches, he produced what appeared to be purchase agreements showing that I had sold him all rights to my designs months earlier. Forgeries, of course, but sophisticated ones. Mr. Carter fell silent, staring at the photograph with an expression that mixed love and loss in equal measure. Junie could see the young man he had been, full of dreams and trust, standing beside someone he believed was his closest friend. The betrayal must have been devastating, not just financially, but emotionally. The destruction of faith in human goodness that only comes from being wounded by someone you love. What happened to Billy? She asked quietly. He disappeared for about 10 years. When he surfaced again, he was living in California under a different name, running a small custom car shop. By then, the statute of limitations had run out on any criminal charges, and I had no money left for civil litigation. I heard he died about 5 years ago. Liver problems, apparently. Mr. Carter carefully tucked the photograph back into his shirt pocket. I never found out what happened to Evangeline until now. Maybe Billy felt bad about what he did, Junie suggested with the optimism that only children can maintain in the face of evidence to the contrary. Maybe he brought her here because he wanted you to find her someday. Mr. Carter's smile was sad but genuine. You have a kind heart, little one. I wish I could believe that. But Billy Hartwell was many things. Charming, brilliant, persuasive, but I don't think remorse was in his nature. A sound of approaching vehicles interrupted their conversation. Through the trees, they could see the now familiar convoy of legal officials, insurance investigators, and journalists making their way toward Evangeline's clearing. The circus was about to begin again, with lawyers and experts who would measure and photograph and debate ownership of something that had been born from dreams and crafted with love. They can study her and argue about her, Mr. Carter said, rising slowly from the log. But they can't understand what she really is. They see dollar signs and legal precedents. They don't see the thousands of hours of work, the passion that went into every curve, the hope that she represented for a different kind of future. Junie stood beside him, her small hand slipping into his weathered one. I see it, she said simply. And that's what matters, isn't it? That someone understands what she really means. Mr. Carter squeezed her hand gently, and for the first time, since the lawyers had arrived in Millfield, he felt something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. Perhaps the real victory wasn't in winning legal battles or recovering stolen property. Perhaps it was in finding someone who could see past the rust and moss to the dream that lay underneath, someone who understood that the greatest treasures couldn't be measured in dollars or displayed in museums. Yes, he said softly, watching. As the officials began to surround his masterpiece once again, that's exactly what matters. The legal team arrived at dawn like an invasion force, armed with clipboards, cameras, and an air of bureaucratic efficiency that transformed the peaceful forest clearing into something resembling a crime scene. Junie watched from behind a massive pine tree as men in expensive suits surrounded Evangeline, their voices carrying across the morning air in sharp, professional tones that had nothing to do with love or dreams or the magic of discovery. We need to document every modification, every serial number, every piece of evidence that might establish provenance, announced the lead investigator, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses. who looked like he had never gotten his hands dirty in his entire life. "I want photographs from every angle, and I want that vehicle moved to a secure facility for proper examination." Mr. Carter stood at the edge of the clearing, his face carved from stone, as he watched strangers prepare to take away his life's work once again. Junie could see his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his whole body radiating a tension that spoke of barely controlled emotion. She wanted to run to him, to offer comfort, but something held her back, an instinct that this moment required careful observation rather than impulsive action. The investigators worked with methodical precision, measuring, photographing, cataloging every detail of Evangeline's construction. They paid particular attention to areas where serial numbers might be found, scraping away rust and moss with tools that seemed invasive and harsh against the car's weathered beauty. "Got something here?" called one of the technicians, a young woman with short red hair who was examining the dashboard with a magnifying glass. "There's definitely a serial number on the instrument panel, but it looks like someone tried to file it off. Probably the thief, trying to hide the evidence," the lead investigator noted with satisfaction, making notes on his clipboard. That actually supports Mr. Carter's claim that the vehicle was stolen. But Junie wasn't listening to the adults anymore. Her attention had been caught by something else entirely, a small irregularity in the car's interior that everyone else seemed to have missed. While the investigators focused on official markings and obvious evidence, she had noticed that one section of the dashboard didn't quite align with the rest. It was subtle, the kind of detail that only someone who had spent hours sitting in the driver's seat would notice, but there was definitely a seam that didn't belong. Moving carefully to avoid drawing attention from the busy investigators, Junie slipped around to the passenger side of the car and climbed inside. The investigators were so focused on their systematic examination that they barely glanced at the 7-year-old who had been a fixture at the site for weeks. Up close, the irregularity was even more obvious. What she had taken for a decorative panel was actually a cleverly concealed compartment, its edges worn smooth by decades of temperature changes and humidity. Her small fingers found the hidden catch almost by accident, pressing against what felt like a slightly raised section of trim. The panel slid open with a soft click that was lost in the noise of the investigation happening around her. Inside, the hidden space, wrapped in oiled leather that had protected them from moisture and time, were documents that would change everything. The first item was a set of blueprints, rolled tightly and secured with a rubber band that crumbled at her touch. Even in the dim light of the car's interior, she could see that these were original drawings, in Mr. Carter's distinctive hand, detailed specifications that matched the sketches in his notebook, but were far more complete and professional. But it was the letter that made her heart race. Written on personal stationery in faded blue ink, the letter was addressed simply to Ezra, in handwriting that was careful and deliberate, as if each word had been chosen with painful consideration. The date at the top was only 3 years old, which meant it had been placed in the compartment long after Evangeline had been hidden in the woods. Junie's reading skills were good for her age, but some of the words in the letter were beyond her. Still, she could understand enough to realize that she was holding something extraordinarily important. Her hands trembling, she climbed out of the car and walked quickly to where Mr. Carter stood watching the investigators. "Mr. Carter," she whispered, tugging gently at his sleeve, "I found something. Something you need to see." He looked down at her with distracted eyes, his attention still focused on the strangers who were handling his masterpiece with clinical detachment. "Not now, child. This isn't a good time for—" "It's a letter," Junie interrupted, her voice urgent but quiet. "A letter to you, from inside a secret hiding place in the car." That got his attention. Mr. Carter's eyes focused on her with laser intensity, taking in her flushed cheeks and the papers clutched in her small hands. Without a word, he followed her away from the clearing to a quiet spot behind a cluster of pine trees where they could have privacy. With shaking hands, Mr. Carter unfolded the letter and began to read. Junie watched his face transform as he processed. The words, confusion giving way to shock, then to something that might have been wonder, and finally to tears that he didn't try to hide. "Dear God," he whispered, sinking onto a fallen log as if his legs could no longer support him. "Billy, you magnificent, impossible fool." "What does it say?" Junie asked, settling beside him with the patience that had become natural during their many conversations. Mr. Carter's voice was rough with emotion as he began to read aloud, translating the more complex passages into language a 7-year-old could understand. "My dear friend Ezra, if you are reading this, then my plan has worked, and Evangeline has found her way home to you. I know that plan probably seems like too generous a word for what I did all those years ago, but I hope that by the time you finish reading this letter, you might understand that even the worst mistakes can sometimes lead to unexpected grace. I won't insult you by trying to justify what I did in 1967. There is no justification for betraying the trust of someone who believed in me completely. I was young and stupid and terrified that our company was going to fail, and I convinced myself that taking Evangeline was somehow saving her from bankruptcy and obscurity. I told myself I would return her to you once I had made enough money to pay back our debts and restart the company on solid ground. But money is like quicksand, Ezra. The more I had, the more I seemed to need, and there was always another reason. To postpone doing the right thing. Years turned into decades, and doing the right thing became impossibly complicated by statute of limitations and the simple passage of time. When the doctors told me I had 6 months to live, I knew I had to find a way to return what I had stolen, not just the car, but your faith in human decency. I couldn't simply drive up to your house and hand you the keys. That would have been too easy, too simple for the magnitude of what I owed you. So I devised something else, a treasure hunt worthy of the dreams we once shared. I spent months researching your life in Millfield, learning about your routines, your habits, the places you went. I discovered the woods where you walk your dog every morning, and I found the perfect clearing where Evangeline could wait in safety until someone with the right eyes and heart discovered her. The beauty of it, Ezra, is that I didn't leave this to chance. I left it to childhood. Children see magic where adults see only problems. Children ask questions that cut through decades of adult complications. I knew that when the right child found Evangeline, that child would recognize her beauty, even beneath the moss and rust. And I knew that child would eventually lead you back to her. Inside this compartment, you'll find the original blueprints that prove your authorship of every innovative system Evangeline contains. You'll also find a notarized confession of my theft, along with documentation that transfers all rights to the Evangeline design back to you, retroactively, as if the theft had never happened. I can't give you back the 40 years I stole from you, Ezra. I can't return the recognition you deserved or the company we should have built together. But I can give you back your masterpiece, and perhaps, if I'm very lucky, I can give you back some faith in the possibility that even the deepest wrongs can sometimes find their way to redemption. She's worth $20 million now, according to the automotive experts I consulted. But we both know her real value can't be measured in money. She's worth the dreams of 2 young men who believed they could change the world. She's worth the proof that innovation and artistry matter more than profit margins. Most of all, she's worth the hope that second chances are possible, even when they seem to come too late. I hope you can forgive me, old friend. I hope that when you run your hands over her restored surface, you'll remember the excitement we felt when we first brought her to life. And I hope that whatever years you have left will be filled with the recognition and respect that should have been yours all along. Your repentant partner, William Hartwell, P.S. Tell the child who found her that she was part of the plan from the beginning. Some magic requires small hands and innocent hearts to work properly. The clearing around them had fallen silent, except for the sound of Mr. Carter's quiet sobs and the distant voices of investigators who were still cataloguing evidence they didn't know was about to become irrelevant. Junie sat beside her friend, her small hand resting on his arm, understanding that she was witnessing something profound, the moment when a 40-year-old wound finally began to heal. "He was waiting for me to find her," she whispered, the full implications of Billy's plan beginning to dawn on her. "He knew I would explore the woods. He knew I would bring you back to her." Mr. Carter nodded, unable to speak as he carefully folded the letter and held it against his chest like a precious treasure. After 4 decades of carrying anger and betrayal like a stone in his heart, he was finally free to remember his old friend with love instead of bitterness. "Some magic requires small hands and innocent hearts," he repeated softly, looking at Junie with eyes that shone with tears and wonder. Billy always was smarter than either of us gave him credit for. The discovery of Billy Hartwell's letter transformed everything, but not in the way Junie had expected. Instead of ending the legal complications, it seemed to multiply them exponentially. Within hours of Mr. Carter presenting the documents to the investigators, the story had exploded beyond the boundaries of small-town Georgia and into the national consciousness. CNN picked up the story first, describing it as the Great Automotive Redemption, and featuring interviews with classic car experts who declared Evangeline to be one of the most significant automotive discoveries of the century. The Today Show followed with a remote broadcast from Millfield's town square, turning their quiet community into a temporary media circus, complete with satellite trucks and correspondent tents. But with the national attention came an army of lawyers, representing interests that Junie couldn't have imagined in her worst nightmares. Billy Hartwell's estate, apparently worth considerably more than anyone had realized, was being contested by 3 different sets of relatives who had emerged from the woodwork with competing claims. The state of Georgia was arguing that any treasure found on public land belonged to the Commonwealth. An automotive museum in California was insisting that they had a contract with Billy to purchase any significant automotive artifacts in his possession. Most troubling of all was a lawyer representing something called the Hartwell Trust, who claimed that Billy had been mentally incompetent during his final years and that any documents he had created were therefore invalid. This man, who wore expensive suits and spoke in clipped, precise sentences, seemed determined to prove that Billy's letter was either a forgery or the product of a diseased mind. "It's preposterous," he announced during a press conference on the courthouse steps. "My client suffered from advanced liver disease and was heavily medicated during his final months. The idea that he could have orchestrated some elaborate treasure hunt is pure fantasy. This letter is nothing more than the desperate fabrication of a man trying to steal a $20 million automobile." Junie watched this press conference from her living room, sitting on the floor in front of the television, with Mr. Buttons in her lap, and a feeling of helpless anger building in her chest. She didn't understand all the legal language, but she understood perfectly well that this man in his expensive suit was calling Mr. Carter a liar and a thief. "That's not true," she said to the television screen, her voice sharp with indignation. "Mr. Carter would never steal anything from anybody." Mama, who had been watching the coverage with growing concern, settled onto the couch behind her daughter. "I know, baby. But unfortunately, the truth isn't always enough in situations like this. Mr. Carter is going to need a good lawyer and some solid evidence if he wants to keep that car. He has Billy's letter. He has the blueprints. He has all those drawings. He's been carrying around for 40 years. Yes, but the other side has lawyers who specialize in making honest people look dishonest. It's going to be a real fight." That evening, Junie sat at her small desk in her bedroom, working by the light of her princess lamp on what might have been the most important art project of her life. using her best colored pencils and a piece of construction paper that she had been saving for something special. She was creating a card that would somehow capture everything she felt about Mr. Carter, about Evangeline, about the magic of their friendship and the wrongness of people who wanted to take away something so precious. The front of the card showed a drawing of Evangeline as she really was, not the rust-covered relic that everyone else saw, but the beautiful, gleaming masterpiece that Junie could envision in her mind. She drew the car with careful attention to the curves that Mr. Carter had taught her to appreciate, the elegant lines that spoke of speed and grace and dreams made manifest in metal and chrome. On the inside, in her very best handwriting, she wrote, "Dear Mr. Carter, I know the lawyers are trying to say mean things about you and Billy and Evangeline. They don't understand that some things are more important than money. They don't understand that Evangeline belongs with someone who loves her. I want to help you fight for her. I want to tell the judge that I found Billy's letter and that it's real and that you didn't steal anything. I want to tell them that you love Evangeline more than any museum or collector ever could. I promise I will be brave and tell the truth, even if it's scary. Because that's what friends do for each other. You are the best friend I ever had, besides Mr. Buttons and Rusty. You taught me that dreams are worth fighting for and that beauty can hide in unexpected places. Now, I want to help you fight for your dream love, Junie. P.S. I made you a picture of how Evangeline will look when she's all fixed up and beautiful again. That's how I see her in my heart." The next morning, she found Mr. Carter sitting on his front porch, staring at the stack of legal papers that seemed to grow larger every day. He looked older than she had ever seen him, worn down by the weight of fighting battles he thought he had left behind decades ago. "I brought you something," she said, climbing the porch steps with the card held carefully in both hands. Mr. Carter accepted the card with the gentle reverence he had always shown for her childish gifts. But when he opened it and read her message, something fundamental shifted in his expression. The weariness was still there, but underneath it was something new, a quiet strength that seemed to radiate from the simple words of a 7-year-old who believed in him completely. "You want to testify for me?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "If they'll let me. Mama says children can talk to judges if they have something important to say. And I have lots of important things to say about you and Evangeline. Junie, these lawyers can be very intimidating. They might ask you hard questions, try to confuse you, or make you doubt what you saw. Let them try," Junie said with the fierce confidence that only children possess when they know they're absolutely right. "I know what I found. I know what Billy's letter said, and I know that you love Evangeline more than anybody else in the whole world." Word of Junie's determination to testify spread through Millfield's tight-knit community like wildfire, and the response was overwhelming. Mrs. Patterson organized a bake sale to help with Mr. Carter's legal expenses. The men at Dot's Diner started a collection jar beside the cash register. Even the elementary school principal, who had heard about Junie's involvement from her mother, sent a letter to the court, vouching for the child's honesty and reliability. "That little girl has never told a lie in her life," Mrs. Henderson wrote. "If Junie Williams says she found something, then she found it. If she says Mr. Carter is a good man, then he's a good man. I would trust her word over any number of lawyers in expensive suits." The community support seemed to energize Mr. Carter in ways that Junie hadn't seen before. He began preparing for the court hearing with the same methodical attention to detail that he had once brought to designing revolutionary automobiles. He organized his sketches and blueprints into chronological order, prepared detailed explanations of Evangeline's innovative features, and practiced telling his story in clear, simple terms that judges and juries could understand. More importantly, he began to remember who he had been before Billy's betrayal had broken his spirit. The man who had dreamed of changing the automotive industry was still there, buried under 40 years of disappointment, but not destroyed. Junie's unwavering faith in him was like sunlight on soil that had been frozen too long. Slowly but surely, life was beginning to stir again. "You know," he said one afternoon as they sat beside Evangeline, now secured behind official barriers while the legal proceedings played out, "I had forgotten what it felt like to have someone believe in me completely." "Lots of people believe in you now," Junie pointed out. "The whole town is on your side." "Yes, but it started with you. A 7-year-old girl who saw beauty where others saw junk, who asked questions that cut straight to the heart of things, who kept a promise even when keeping it was hard." He smiled at her, and for the first time since she had known him, it was a smile completely free of sadness. Billy was right about one thing. Some magic does require small hands and innocent hearts. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and as the date approached, Junie felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness that made it hard to sleep. She had never been inside a real courtroom, had never spoken to a judge, had never been responsible for helping someone she loved fight for something so important. But every time doubt crept into her mind, she would look at the card she had made for Mr. Carter, now displayed prominently on his kitchen table, and remember the promise she had written inside. She had told him she would be brave and tell the truth, and she intended to keep that promise, no matter how scary the lawyers might be. On Monday night, as she was getting ready for bed, Mama came into her room and sat on the edge of the bed with an expression that was both proud and concerned. "Are you sure you want to do this tomorrow, baby? It's going to be a big room full of grown-ups asking you questions about very complicated things." Junie nodded firmly, clutching Mr. Buttons against her chest. "Mr. Carter needs me, Mama, and sometimes when someone you love needs you, you have to be brave even when you're scared." Mama smiled and kissed her forehead. "When did my little girl get so wise?" "Mr. Carter taught me that wisdom isn't about how old you are," Junie said, repeating something he had told her weeks earlier. "It's about paying attention to what really matters and being brave enough to fight for it." Outside her window, lightning bugs began their nightly dance among the pine trees, tiny lights in the darkness that reminded her of magic and wonder and the extraordinary things that could happen when small hands reached for impossible dreams. Chapter Courthouse in downtown Millfield had been built in 1923, during an era when civic buildings were designed to inspire respect and perhaps a little intimidation. Its tall ceilings, dark wood paneling, and imposing judge's bench had witnessed decades of human drama, but rarely had they hosted a case that had captured the attention of automotive enthusiasts and legal experts from across the country. Junie sat in the front row beside her mother, wearing her best dress, a blue one with tiny flowers that Mama had bought for church services, and clutching Mr. Buttons with white-knuckled intensity. The courtroom was packed with reporters, lawyers, curious townspeople, and what appeared to be several very serious men in expensive suits who kept whispering to each other and taking notes. Mr. Carter sat at the plaintiff's table with his attorney, a kind-faced woman named Sarah Collins, who had driven down from Atlanta specifically to take his case. Mrs. Collins had explained to Junie that she specialized in intellectual property disputes, which seemed to mean helping people prove that their ideas and creations really belonged to them. She had been fascinated by Billy Hartwell's letter and had immediately recognized its significance. "Your Honor," Mrs. Collins began when Judge Morrison called the court to order, "this case is fundamentally about justice delayed, but not denied. For 40 years, my client has lived with the knowledge that his life's greatest achievement was stolen from him by someone he trusted completely. Today, we have the opportunity to right that wrong and restore to Mr. Carter what was always rightfully his." The opposing attorney, representing the Hartwell Trust, was a shark-like man named Davidson, who clearly enjoyed the spotlight that came with high-profile cases. "Your Honor," he countered, "what we have here is an elaborate fraud perpetrated by a desperate old man who sees dollar signs instead of legal reality." The documentation he claims proves his ownership is clearly fabricated, and his key witness is a 7-year-old child whose testimony cannot possibly be considered reliable. When Mrs. Collins called Mr. Carter to the witness stand, Junie watched. Her friend walked slowly but steadily across the courtroom, his shoulders straight and his head held high. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth with a voice that carried 40 years of pain, but also a quiet dignity that seemed to fill the room. His testimony was methodical and compelling. He described the partnership with Billy Hartwell, the development of Evangeline's revolutionary design features, the morning he discovered everything stolen. He showed the judge his original sketches, explaining each technical innovation in language that was clear and accessible. Most importantly, he read Billy's confession letter aloud, his voice breaking slightly as he shared his old friend's words of remorse and redemption. "And then," Mrs. Collins said, "I'd like to call our next witness, Junie Williams." The walk to the witness stand felt like the longest journey of Junie's young life. She had never been the center of attention in such a formal, intimidating setting, and she could feel the eyes of every adult in the room focused on her. But when she looked at Mr. Carter, he gave her an encouraging nod and touched his shirt pocket, where she knew he kept the original key to Evangeline. Judge Morrison, a grandfatherly man with kind eyes, leaned forward slightly as Junie was sworn in. "Now, Miss Williams, I understand you made an important discovery. Can you tell us about that in your own words?" Junie took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice small but clear in the large courtroom. She told the story exactly as it had happened. Finding Evangeline in the woods, meeting Mr. Carter, noticing the irregular panel in the dashboard, discovering the hidden compartment with Billy's letter and the blueprints. "And what made you notice this hiding place when all the adult investigators missed it?" Mrs. Collins asked gently. "I spent a lot of time sitting in Evangeline," Junie explained. "When you sit somewhere a lot, you notice things that don't look right. The panel was just a little bit different from the rest of the dashboard, like it was supposed to open, but nobody knew how." Mr. Davidson's cross-examination was aggressive and condescending, clearly designed to rattle a young witness. "Isn't it true, young lady, that you've been coached by Mr. Carter to tell this story? Isn't it convenient that a child would supposedly find evidence that trained investigators missed?" Junie looked at him with the steady gaze that only comes from knowing you're telling the absolute truth. "Nobody coached me, sir. I found Billy's letter because I was curious about why the panel looked different, and Mr. Carter was just as surprised as everybody else when I showed it to him." "Your Honor," Mrs. Collins interjected, "I'd like to present one final piece of evidence." She gestured to Mr. Carter, who stood and reached into his pocket. What he withdrew was a small brass key, old and worn smooth by decades of handling, but clearly original to the vehicle's era. The key bore the same distinctive logo that appeared on Evangeline's steering wheel and instrument panel. "Mr. Carter has carried this key for 40 years, Mrs. Collins explained. "It's the original key to Evangeline, cut when she was first built. If this court would permit, we'd like to demonstrate that this key still starts the vehicle, something that would be impossible if Mr. Carter's claims were fraudulent." Judge Morrison looked intrigued. "The court will adjourn to the evidence lot where the vehicle is being held." The entire courtroom filed outside to where Evangeline sat behind a chain-link fence, looking somehow more dignified despite her weathered condition. Mr. Carter approached the car with reverent care, the brass he catching the afternoon sunlight as he inserted it into the ignition. For a moment, nothing happened. 40 years was a long time for any mechanical device to sit idle, and Junie held her breath as Mr. Carter tried again, this time pressing the accelerator slightly as he turned the key. Evangeline's engine turned, over with a cough, sputtered, and then roared to life with a sound unlike anything Junie had ever heard. It wasn't the rough idle of a modern car. It was something deeper, more musical, a mechanical symphony that spoke of precision engineering and passionate craftsmanship. "That sound," breathed one of the automotive experts who had been following. "The case. That's the prototype V8 engine Carter designed. No other car in the world sounds exactly like that." The crowd around the fence fell silent as the engine settled into a smooth, powerful rhythm. Mr. Carter sat behind the wheel with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, his hands gripping the steering wheel he had designed decades ago. For the first time in 40 years, Evangeline was alive again, and her creator was where he belonged. Judge Morrison watched the scene with an expression that had shifted from judicial skepticism to something approaching wonder. "Mr. Carter," he said finally, "please turn off the engine. I believe I've heard enough." As they filed back into the courtroom, Junie caught sight of Mr. Davidson's face and was surprised to see that even the shark-like lawyer looked shaken. There was something about the sound of that engine, the obvious authenticity of the moment, that transcended legal arguments and monetary valuations. This wasn't just about ownership documents or chain of custody. This was about a man and his creation, separated by betrayal but reunited by fate, and the curious heart of a 7-year-old girl who had known beauty when she saw it. Judge Morrison took exactly 17 minutes to render his decision. 17 minutes during which the packed courtroom sat in absolute silence, the only sounds being the occasional creak of old wooden benches and the soft scratch of reporters' pens against paper. Junie counted each minute on the large clock mounted above the judge's bench, her small hand gripping Mr. Carter's weathered one as they waited to learn whether 40 years of injustice would finally be corrected. When Judge Morrison returned to his bench, his expression was grave but determined. He settled his reading glasses on his nose and looked out over the courtroom with the air of a man who understood that his words would carry weight far beyond the legal precedent they set. "In 40 years on this bench," he began, "I have rarely encountered a case that so clearly illustrates the difference between legal technicalities and fundamental justice. The evidence presented today, both documentary and testimonial, leaves no doubt in this court's mind regarding the true ownership of the vehicle in question." Junie held her breath, squeezing Mr. Carter's hand so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Mr. William Hartwell's confession letter, authenticated by 3 separate handwriting experts, provides clear and convincing evidence of theft. The original blueprints found in the vehicle's hidden compartment bear notations and design details that could only have been created by their original author. Most compelling of all, Mr. Carter's possession of the original ignition key, a key that successfully started a vehicle that has sat idle for decades, provides physical proof of ownership that transcends any documentary evidence. Judge Morrison's gaze shifted to the defense table, where Mr. Davidson sat with the resigned expression of a man who knew he had lost. "The court finds the claims of mental incompetence to be without merit. Mr. Hartwell's letter demonstrates clear thinking, detailed planning, and a sophisticated understanding of legal principles. His decision to hide the vehicle and its documentation as part of an elaborate restitution plan shows creativity and forethought, not dementia. Furthermore," the judge continued, "this court has been moved by the testimony of Miss Junie Williams, whose honest account of her discovery has provided crucial evidence in this case. It is rare to encounter a witness of any age whose truthfulness is so evident and whose motives are so pure." Junie felt her cheeks flush as several people in the courtroom turned to smile at her, but she kept her eyes fixed on Judge Morrison's face. "Therefore, this court hereby rules that the 1967 prototype vehicle known as Evangeline is and has always been the rightful property of Mr. Ezra Carter. All claims by the Hartwell Trust are dismissed with prejudice. Mr. Carter, the vehicle is yours, along with all rights to its design innovations and any future commercial applications thereof." The gavel came down with a sound like thunder, and the courtroom erupted into applause. Junie launched herself into Mr. Carter's arms as reporters surged forward and cameras flashed like strobe lights. Mrs. Collins was beaming as she shook hands with her client, while Mr. Davidson gathered his papers with the efficient resignation of a professional who had lost fair and square. Outside the courthouse, the media circus that had descended upon Millfield took on a celebratory atmosphere. Instead of the sensationalized treasure hunt narrative that had dominated earlier coverage, the story was now being framed as a tale of justice delayed but not denied, of friendship transcending betrayal, and of a child's innocent curiosity uncovering decades-old secrets. "Mr. Carter," called one reporter, "now that you've been awarded ownership of a vehicle worth $20 million, what do you plan to do with it?" Mr. Carter stood on the courthouse steps with Junie beside him, his arm around her shoulders, in a gesture that had become natural over the weeks of their friendship. "Evangeline was never about money," he said, his voice carrying clearly over the crowd. "She was about innovation, about pushing the boundaries of what was possible, about dreams made real through hard work and imagination. But surely you'll—" "Isella," pressed another reporter, $20 million could change your entire life." "It already has," Mr. Carter replied, glancing down at Junie with a smile that transformed his entire face. "This young lady and her discovery have given me something more valuable than money. They've given me back my purpose." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts before making an announcement that would surprise even Junie. "I plan to restore Evangeline to her original glory. But she won't be sitting in some private collector's garage or museum display case. Instead, she'll become the centerpiece of the Carter Institute for Automotive Innovation, a learning center I'm establishing right here in Millfield." The crowd buzzed with surprise and interest as Mr. Carter continued. "Half of Evangeline's assessed value will go toward building this institute, which will offer programs for young people interested in engineering, design, and innovation. The other half will establish a scholarship fund for students who want to pursue careers in automotive technology but lack the financial means to do so." "What about the local community?" asked a reporter from the regional television station. "Millfield has embraced me for 15 years without asking questions about my past or my reasons for isolation. It's time I gave something back." Mr. Carter's voice carried the confidence of a man who had rediscovered his sense of purpose. "I'm also donating $500,000 to upgrade the elementary school's science and technology programs. After all, if we're going to inspire the next generation of innovators, we need to start early." Junie looked up at her friend with shining eyes, understanding that this was about more than money or recognition. Mr. Carter had spent 40 years feeling like his dreams had been stolen from him, but now he was choosing to use his restored fortune to nurture dreams in others. That evening, as the media circus began to disperse and Millfield started to return to its normal quiet rhythm, Junie sat with Mr. Carter on his front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. Between them, on the porch swing, sat a manila envelope containing the legal documents that officially transferred ownership of Evangeline back to her creator. Papers that represented not just property rights, but the restoration of a man's faith in justice and redemption. "Mr. Carter," Junie said thoughtfully, "do you think Billy knew all this would happen when he hid Evangeline in the woods?" Mr. Carter considered the question seriously, as he always did when Junie asked him something important. "I think Billy knew that the right child would find her eventually. Someone with enough curiosity to discover the hidden compartment, enough honesty to share what they found, and enough courage to fight for what was right." He squeezed her hand gently. "I don't think he could have predicted how perfect that child would be, but I think he had faith that the universe would send the right person when the time was right."